December 2nd, 1805. A pale winter sun hovers above the frost-bitten hills of Moravia. The ground is cold, the air sharp as steel, and a veil of mist drifts across the valleys. Beneath that mist lies destiny. The cannons are silent for now, but every man standing upon this frozen earth can feel it. The tremor before the storm that will decide the fate of Europe. At the heart of it all stands one man, small in stature, yet vast in ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. On this day, he will orchestrate a masterpiece that will be remembered for centuries as the very embodiment of military genius, the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's greatest victory. Just months before this fateful dawn, Europe had once again banded together against the young emperor. The Third Coalition, a grand alliance of Britain, Austria, and Russia, sworn to crush the upstart Corsican who had dared to crown himself emperor. To them, Napoleon was not merely a threat, he was an infection, spreading revolution, defiance, and change across monarchies built on centuries of privilege. Yet to France, and to those who followed him, he was something else entirely. The man who had rebuilt a nation from the ashes of revolution, who promised glory, and whose star seemed to rise higher with every victory. In early 1805, his great army, the Grande Armée, had been gathered on the windswept coasts of northern France. For months they had waited, trained, and dreamed of crossing the English Channel to invade Britain. But Napoleon's plans shifted with the winds of opportunity. When Austria and Russia began to move, he saw a chance to strike not across the sea, but across the heart of Europe. He turned his men eastward, 200,000 soldiers marching with a precision and speed the world had never seen. Their boots thundered over the Rhine, through Bavaria, and deep into the Austrian lands. And by October, they had achieved what no one thought possible: the capture of an entire Austrian army at Ulm. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon had destroyed the coalition's main force without a single grand battle. But the war was far from over. The Russians were coming, led by Tsar Alexander I and seasoned generals hardened by years of war against the Ottomans. They would join what remained of the Austrian forces, and together they planned to confront Napoleon once and for all in the rolling plains of Moravia. To them, Napoleon was overextended. Too far from France, his supply lines stretched thin, his army tired from months of marching. Surely, they thought, the emperor's luck had finally run out. But Napoleon was no gambler. He was a mathematician of war, calculating every risk, every illusion, every emotion of his enemy. What the coalition mistook for weakness, he had deliberately crafted. He wanted them to believe he was on the defensive, to lure them into his trap. It was deception on a grand scale. As he withdrew his forces from the high ground around Brunn, he sent word through captured dispatches and local spies that his army was demoralized, undersupplied, and ready to retreat. The Allies took the bait. By late November, the Russian and Austrian armies, nearly 90,000 strong, marched toward him with confidence. They saw before them a French force that seemed weary and diminished. Around 68,000 men, fewer in number, and apparently clinging to a precarious position near the small town of Austerlitz. But the emperor's every move had been deliberate. The ground he had chosen was no accident. To the north rose the gentle heights of the Pratzen Plateau, a broad ridge commanding the entire battlefield. To the south, the land dipped into marshy low ground, threaded by frozen ponds and winding streams. It looked like an ideal position for the Allies to attack, if they believed the French center was weak, and that was exactly what Napoleon wanted them to believe. On the evening of December 1st, Napoleon stood with his marshals upon a low rise, gazing through the haze at the distant flicker of Allied campfires. His enemies were making their final preparations, confident that the morning would bring the annihilation of the French army. Around him, his officers murmured their doubts. Marshal Soult, Marshal Lannes, Marshal Bernadotte, all veterans of 100 campaigns, could sense the danger of being outnumbered. But Napoleon, calm and radiant, merely smiled. "They are in the trap," he said softly. "Tomorrow we shall finish this war with a thunderbolt." The night was long and cold. The mist thickened, wrapping the camps in silence. French soldiers huddled near dying embers, shivering in their thin coats, while their emperor, dressed simply in his gray greatcoat and bicorn hat, rode among them, stopping to speak with the men. He asked where they came from, how they fought at Ulm, if their families were proud, and to each man he offered the same quiet promise: tomorrow you will see your emperor at his best. Before dawn, the mist began to glow faintly with the first light of the rising sun. Across the valley, the Allied army stirred. Columns of Russian infantry began to move, dark shapes shifting through the fog, banners fluttering in the cold wind. Their plan was simple: strike hard at Napoleon's right flank, overwhelm it, and cut off his retreat toward Vienna. The French center, they believed, was weak and could be crushed later. They had no idea that Napoleon's right was a baited snare, a carefully laid illusion. As the Allied columns moved southward, Napoleon watched from a ridge near the village of Zuran. His marshals gathered around him: Soult, Lannes, Berthier, and Murat, the dashing cavalry commander, whose plumed helmet gleamed even in the mist. They waited for the right moment, the perfect moment. "One sharp blow in the center," Napoleon said, his voice steady. "That will cut them in two and destroy them all." It was now 8 a.m. The mist still clung to the ground, thick and silver, hiding the movement of thousands. The Allies continued to shift their troops toward the south, leaving the Pratzen Heights, the key to the entire field, dangerously exposed. It was exactly what Napoleon had predicted. Turning to Marshal Soult, he gave the command that would change history. "How long will it take your men to reach the top?" Soult studied the heights, gauged the distance. "Less than 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon nodded slowly. "Good. We shall wait another quarter of an hour, then we will crush them." Moments later, the sun broke through the mist. It was as if heaven itself had chosen that instant. A brilliant golden light flooded the valley, the famous Sun of Austerlitz. The French soldiers, chilled to the bone and blinded by fog all morning, now found themselves bathed in warmth and light. To them, it was a sign, divine, triumphant, almost prophetic. Napoleon lifted his hand toward the sky and said quietly, "Now, gentlemen, the battle begins." He raised his glass, scanning the vast field before him. Tens of thousands of men locked in motion, drums beating, flags whipping in the wind. The emperor turned to Soult. "Advance and occupy the Pratzen Heights." Soult saluted, spurred his horse, and rode to his corps. The trumpets sounded, the drums rolled, and the French columns began to march. Bayonets gleamed like rivers of steel in the morning light as they climbed the gentle slopes. From the mist below, Russian officers suddenly saw the movement and realized, too late, what was happening. Their own center had been stripped bare to reinforce the southern attack. Now the French were rising to seize the commanding ground. At that moment, Napoleon's trap snapped shut. As Soult's men surged up the slopes, the morning calm shattered. Muskets cracked through the air, cannon roared, and the battlefield awoke in thunder. The ground shook as thousands of boots trampled the frozen earth. The French advance was deliberate, unstoppable, their bayonets flashing like lightning under the rising sun. Atop his horse, Napoleon watched the movement unfold like the gears of a perfect machine. Each corps, each regiment, positioned precisely as he had envisioned the night before. Marshal Soult's Fourth Corps climbed steadily toward the crest of the Pratzen Heights, where Russian General Collerat had hastily rallied his men. The Russian guns opened fire, their cannonballs tearing through the fog, shattering trees and men alike. Yet the French kept coming. Drums beat the rhythm of destiny. "Forward! Vive l'Empereur!" The cry rose like a wave, and even the thunder of artillery could not drown it out. The Russians, realizing their danger, scrambled to hold their line, but it was too late. The momentum was with Napoleon. The Allied commanders, down in the south, still believed they were winning. Their columns under Generals Buxhowden and Langeron had pushed hard against Napoleon's right, where Marshal Davout's men fought with fierce tenacity. The fighting there was savage, close quarters combat in frozen marshes, bayonets and sabers flashing through mist. Davout, one of Napoleon's most disciplined commanders, had arrived after a forced march of nearly 70 miles in 2 days. His men were exhausted, their boots torn, their faces gaunt with cold and hunger. But they held. Every minute they delayed the Allied attack gave Napoleon more time to strike where it mattered most: the center. On the heights, Soult's divisions finally crested the ridge. From there, they could see the entire battlefield spread out beneath them, a living map of chaos and movement. To their left, Lana's corps was locked in combat with the Russian advance near the village of Blasowitz. To their right, Davout's men still clung to the southern line. But here in the center, the heart of the Allied army stood exposed. The French unleashed volley after volley of musket fire, followed by the cold steel of the bayonet. The Russians fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the sheer precision of the French assault. Within minutes, the Pratzen Heights, the key to the entire battle, belonged to Napoleon. From his vantage point near Zuran Hill, Napoleon saw the enemy's line begin to buckle. He turned to Berthier, his chief of staff, and said calmly, "One sharp blow more, and this army is finished." He then gave new orders. The Imperial Guard was to hold in reserve, while Soult pressed his advantage, splitting the enemy in two. To the north, Lannes and Murat would pin the Russian cavalry and prevent their retreat. To the south, Davout was to counterattack and drive the Allies back into the marshes. The plan, crafted in the mind of a man who saw the battlefield as a chessboard, was unfolding with frightening perfection. By late morning, the mist had lifted completely, revealing the full horror of the day. Smoke curled above the fields, men screamed and fell, horses bolted through the chaos. Cannon thunder echoed across the hills, and the acrid stench of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Yet amid the confusion, the French formations held their cohesion, disciplined, steady, unstoppable. The Allied army, stretched thin and scattered across miles of uneven terrain, began to lose all sense of order. Napoleon now rode forward, his gray coat billowing behind him, his face calm and unyielding. As he reached the captured heights, his soldiers erupted into cheers. "Vive l'Empereur!" He acknowledged them with a simple nod, his gaze fixed on the valley below, where the enemy's center was disintegrating. "They are lost," he murmured, "and they do not yet know it." On the Allied side, confusion reigned. Generals Colorad and Miloradovich tried desperately to rally their men, shouting orders over the roar of battle. But communication had broken down entirely. Units that were supposed to be in support had already been drawn into the southern fighting, and those on the northern flank were being pinned by Murat's cavalry. Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, observing from a distant ridge, could scarcely believe what they saw. What had begun as a confident assault had turned into a nightmare of disarray. The very heights they had abandoned were now bristling with French artillery, raining death upon their own troops below. At around noon, Napoleon ordered the decisive stroke. Marshal Soult's corps, reinforced by Saint-Hilaire and Vendôme, was to drive forward from the Pratzen Heights, cutting the Allied army in half. At the same time, Lannes and Murat were to push hard against the northern flank, keeping the enemy cavalry from regrouping. The French artillery opened up with devastating precision. Cannonballs ripped through ranks of Russian infantry, sending men and horses tumbling into heaps. The ground trembled under the continuous barrage. The Sun of Austerlitz blazed high above, turning the drifting smoke into a golden haze, a cruelly beautiful light over the field of death. Soult's men advanced again, descending from the heights into the valley, their drums pounding like the heartbeat of France. They crashed into the remnants of the Russian center, shattering it completely. The Allied line was now broken, severed in two like a ship's hull split upon the rocks. To the south, panic spread as word of the collapse reached the troops still fighting Davout. Russian and Austrian regiments, cut off and leaderless, began to fall back in disorder. Napoleon saw his moment. He turned to Marshal Lannes. Press them without mercy." Murat's cavalry, gleaming in their plumes and gold, surged forward in a wave of motion. French cuirassiers smashed into Russian hussars, sabers clashing, horses screaming. The charge drove deep into the enemy's flank, scattering their formations. Murat himself rode at the head, fearless and flamboyant, his white horse streaked with mud and blood. It was a spectacle of chaos and courage, the kind of moment that defined the age of Napoleon. By early afternoon, the battlefield had become a scene of ruin. Smoke and fog mingled into one dense pall. The cries of the wounded echoed across the valley. The frozen ponds near the villages of Sokolnitz and Telnitz were littered with bodies, men and horses struggling upon the ice. The Allies, desperate to escape, tried to retreat across them, unaware that the French artillery had turned their guns toward the very ground they fled upon. Napoleon gave a subtle nod, and the order was passed. The French batteries opened fire. Cannonballs shattered the ice. The sound was like the cracking of the earth itself. Whole sections of the frozen ponds gave way, plunging hundreds of men and horses into the freezing water below. Panic turned to horror. Soldiers clawed at the broken edges, screaming for help as the ice broke beneath them. In minutes, the surface was littered with debris, muskets, and bodies, sinking into the dark depths. Even the French soldiers, hardened by years of war, stood in grim silence as they watched the destruction unfold. Napoleon, gazing through his telescope, lowered it slowly and said nothing. The trap had closed completely. By 3 p.m., the battle was over. The Allied army was shattered beyond recognition. Of their 90,000 men, more than 36,000 lay dead, wounded, or captured. The French losses were fewer than 9,000. The contrast was staggering, the kind of ratio seen only in the victories of a master. Napoleon rode slowly across the battlefield as the smoke cleared, the sun dipping low in the winter sky. His marshals gathered around him, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. They had seen victories before, Marengo, Ulm, but nothing like this. Austerlitz was not merely a triumph, it was art. It was genius made manifest upon the earth. As evening fell, the emperor halted near the Pratzen Heights, where his imperial guard now stood in silent ranks. He dismounted, removed his gloves, and stood bareheaded in the cold air. All around him lay the echoes of battle, the smell of powder, the distant groans of the dying, the broken flags of the defeated enemy. His men watched as he turned to them and said quietly, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you." His voice carried softly through the night. "You have justified all that I expected of your courage." Then with a hint of solemnity he added, "I will keep my word to those brave men who have fought today. This day will be remembered in the annals of France." Night settled over the fields of Austerlitz. The air was still, the smoke drifting slowly into the dark sky. What hours ago had been a battlefield was now a graveyard. Thousands of fires flickered across the plains as soldiers tended to the wounded, gathered their dead, and whispered prayers for those they could not save. The cries of men and horses mingled with the crackle of burning wagons. The frost had returned, coating the ground in a thin shimmer of white, as if the earth itself sought to hide the horrors of the day beneath a blanket of silence. Napoleon stood among his marshals, his face illuminated by the glow of a single torch. Around him, Soult, Laine, Berthier, Murat, and Davout awaited his words. The emperor's eyes moved slowly over the valley below, where faint fires still burned among the ruins of the Allied camps. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "before this sun sets again, a new Europe will rise." He was right. Austerlitz was more than a battle. It was a message written in blood and brilliance that proclaimed the arrival of a new world order. The Holy Roman Empire, centuries old, crumbled soon after. Emperor Francis of Austria was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Pressburg, ceding vast territories and wealth to France. The Russian army, broken and humiliated, retreated eastward, their alliance shattered. Britain, though still defiant across the Channel, stood alone once more. The Third Coalition, the proud alliance that had sworn to end Napoleon, had ceased to exist. In Paris, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Bells rang in every church, and the city erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, shouting "Vive l'Empereur" as musicians played and fireworks burst over the Seine. In that moment, France was united, not by revolution, not by ideology, but by one man whose victories seemed touched by destiny. The newspapers called it the Sun of Austerlitz, a symbol of the emperor's divine favor, a light that would forever be linked with his name. Across Europe, kings and princes trembled. Diplomats scrambled to secure peace, and generals studied every detail of the battle, seeking to understand how one man could so completely outthink two empires. The answer was simple. Napoleon had turned warfare into an art. His mastery of deception, timing, and movement had transformed battle itself. He fought not just with armies, but with minds. He made his enemies see what he wanted them to see, and when they believed it, he struck. At Austerlitz, he had turned illusion into annihilation. In the weeks that followed, the emperor rewarded his army lavishly. Medals were struck, titles granted, and soldiers promoted on the field. To his men, Napoleon was more than a ruler. He was a symbol of glory, a living legend. Veterans of the battle would speak of it for the rest of their lives. How the mist parted and the sun broke through. How their emperor stood unflinching in the midst of cannon fire. How the world seemed to bow before France that day. For the young soldiers of the Grande Armée, Austerlitz was proof that they served not just a man, but history itself. Yet even in victory there was a shadow. For all his triumph, Napoleon's ambition was insatiable. Austerlitz had made him the master of Europe, but it also planted the seeds of future wars. His power would grow, his empire would expand, and with it, the list of those who sought his downfall. But on that cold December night, none of that mattered. The glory was absolute, the triumph complete. The emperor had gambled. He risked everything and won everything. Reports from the battlefield stunned Europe. Letters told of frozen ponds strewn with shattered cannon and the bodies of men who had drowned as the ice gave way. Entire regiments vanished beneath the surface. Villagers who came later found only silence, an eerie calm broken by crows. Even Napoleon's veterans never forgot that sight. Austerlitz was a triumph of genius paid for in blood. For Napoleon, it was the height of his power. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. Thrones fell, dynasties crumbled, nations reshaped by his will. Yet none of his later victories, Jena, Wagram, Friedland, ever matched Austerlitz. That was the day the emperor stood at the peak of his brilliance, when the world bowed to his design. Historians would call it the Battle of the Three Emperors: Napoleon of France, Alexander of Russia, Francis of Austria, three rulers whose destinies met on a frozen field. Only one emerged immortal. The others faded. For a time, Napoleon's empire seemed eternal. But time spares no one. A decade later, after Moscow burned and Waterloo fell, the man who once ruled Europe sat exiled and alone. He spoke of his battles with pride, but when he recalled Austerlitz, his voice softened. That day, he said, was the finest of my life. For those who survived, the memory never dimmed. The mist, the dawn, the burst of sunlight crowning the emperor in gold, the cry of Vive l'Empereur, echoing through cannon smoke, the moment an army dissolved and history held its breath. That day, Napoleon became legend. 2 centuries later, the name Austerlitz still echoes through history, studied by soldiers, revered by strategists, proof of what brilliance and courage can achieve, and a warning of how ambition can shape the world. On that cold December morning, as the mist lifted and the sun rose over Moravia, a new age was born. The men beneath that light remembered it forever. The world still does. For on that morning, the Sun of Austerlitz rose, and with it, the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories from the pages of history. Tell us what you think. Was Napoleon a brilliant visionary or a ruthless conqueror? Until next time, stay inquisitive and keep uncovering the past that built our world.